Continuamos con la presentación magistral.
Presentación magistral. Perspectiva global y desafíos regionales de las transiciones energéticas justas. Rebecca Gaghen, Jefa de División para Europa, Medio Oriente, África y América Latina, International Energy Agency. Presentador, Carlos Garibaldi, Secretario Ejecutivo de Arpel.
Quien lo desee para esta presentación puede usar la opción de traducción simultánea que encontrará en la app oficial del evento, Semana Arpel Naturgas. Adelante, doctor Carlos, bienvenidos, tienen la palabra.
Rebecca, we're delighted to have you with us. I'm very grateful for the huge effort you made for a long flight from far away from Paris and for a quick round trip to be here only for a day. Neither of us is old enough, but Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz told Toto, we're not in Kansas anymore. Well, Dorothy, we're not in Paris anymore. There may be no place more Latin American, Caribbean than this one, than Cartagena. Everybody agrees here that there can be no doubt that climate change impacts must be urgently mitigated by transitioning to a world with lower greenhouse gas emissions through a massive and radical transformation of how energy is generated, supplied, and used. But meanwhile, energy demand continues to grow, fueled by compounded demographic and economic growth. This obviously creates a tension between mitigating the effects of climate change and continuing to supply sufficient, reliable, and affordable energy. Your job description, your job at the IEA focuses on the Global South. Well, we in the Global South, many of us contend that energy transitions should be plural and just, bespoke to the circumstances and starting point of each country. So, how does the IEA perceive energy transitions in a region and the viability of reaching the global climate objectives in time and form? And I invite you to the podium to address with your slides.
Buenas tardes. Muchas gracias por invitarme. Estoy muy honorada. And now I will switch to English. I have to say I love Paris, but I adore Cartagena. So thank you very much for organizing this here. It's a great privilege. On behalf of the International Energy Agency, we are very pleased to be invited to take part in this prestigious event. Today, I will draw on the IEA's work looking at the global aspects of the clean energy transitions, and then I will move to look more specifically at Latin America and the Caribbean. But first, I would like to start with some historical context. This year, the IEA celebrates its 50th anniversary, and we see parallels between the time of our founding, just after the first oil shock in 1973, and today, in terms of the fragility in energy markets and risks to energy security. So I begin with a few reflections on where we stand today compared with 1973. This slide shows the global energy mix, then and now. Immediately visible is how the shocks of the 1970s prompted diversification away from oil, which is shown in red on the slide. We also see a significant shift in terms of oil demand. In 1973, advanced economies accounted for nearly 80% of demand. This share has now fallen to under 50% due to surging oil demand in advanced and emerging economies. And on the right of the slide, we see how the electricity sector diversified away from oil, with natural gas, nuclear, and renewable energy making up the difference. This brief review highlights three themes that we see as central. First, the enduring importance of energy security and of aligning actions on energy security and emissions reductions as we move through energy transitions and towards a more electrified, renewables-rich system. Second, shifts in the energy mix do happen, and can happen quite quickly, especially when change is prompted by a crisis. We saw that in the aftermath of 1973. Today, we have a much larger portfolio of cost-competitive, clean energy technologies than our counterparts did 50 years ago. And third, it's going to take a large collective effort with a broad range of countries at different stages of development to solve our common challenges. And I'm not only speaking about governments, industry, civil society, everyone needs to be on board. This underlines the importance of international cooperation on energy and climate challenges. And so looking forward, we anticipate even more change. A broader transition is underway, driven by concerns about climate change. More than 140 countries have made net zero pledges, representing 87% of global emissions. Many governments are implementing policies to achieve their pledges, and we are seeing the results. This analysis comes from the IEA World Energy Outlook and is based on our stated policies scenario, which assumes that policies that have been approved are being implemented. And we see some major shifts underway. The first of these is uptake of clean energy technologies, especially electric vehicles and solar photovoltaic. As you can see on the left, in 2020, electric vehicles accounted for 1 in 25 car sales. This has risen to around 1 in 5, and that's a very short time period. This exponential growth of EVs is set to continue, reaching at least half of sales in the major markets of China, the European Union, and the United States by 2030. Meanwhile, solar photovoltaic has also grown rapidly, surpassing 300 gigawatts last year. We anticipate continued strong growth and expect that solar PV and wind will overtake coal before 2030 to become the largest source of electricity generation globally. Another important shift is the slowdown and rebalancing in the Chinese economy, which has basically driven demand and been the dominant factor in the energy sector for the last several decades. The working age population in China has peaked, and so has cement production, followed with steel production close behind. This will have a dramatic impact on demand growth. So based on these trends, we think that the energy world in 2030 will look quite different than it does even today. The number of electric vehicles on the roads will have grown by 10 times. Solar photovoltaic and wind will be the largest sources of electricity generation. More heat pumps and other electric heaters will be sold than fossil fuel boilers. And China's energy demand will be slowly falling. And these shifts lead to other changes. Again, according to our World Energy Outlook analysis, the momentum behind clean energy transitions is now sufficient for global demand for coal, oil, and natural gas to peak before 2030. The share of coal, oil, and natural gas, which has been pretty stable for decades at around 80%, starts to decline. It reaches 73% by 2030. And I note that looking at this slide, I'd like to note that we do look at China separately just because of its prominence. The Chinese economy and energy sector are changing. China is shown in red. As a result of growth in renewable energy and nuclear power in the electricity sector, China's coal demand is set to peak in the next few years and decline. The number of internal combustion engine cars on the road in China will peak by 2030, leading to a peak in China's oil demand this decade. And gas demand will grow more slowly than in the past. Moving to the advanced economies, which are shown in blue. Energy demand has already saturated. The decline of coal demand is set to accelerate as the rate of coal decommissioning increases from 20 gigawatts to 30 gigawatts per year in the coming decade. Oil demand in advanced economies peaked in 2005, and its decline becomes more pronounced in the coming decade. In the longer term, the growth in renewables in power and heat pumps in buildings starts also to reduce gas demand. Now, moving to emerging market and developing economies aside from China, this is shown in yellow on the slide. Here, the trends are slightly different. Coal demand continues to grow, driven by countries such as India. Oil continues to grow up to 2050, with rising population and vehicle ownership in regions such as Southeast Asia and India. Natural gas demand is particularly driven by the Middle East, which will be the largest source of demand growth over the next decade. Gas demand also grows quickly in Africa to support sectors like industry and fertilizer production. Combining these different regional trends leads to a peak for each of the fossil fuels by 2030, and this is without additional climate policies being taken up. So this is the global perspective. Now let's look at Latin America and the Caribbean. Last year, the IEA prepared a special report, the Latin America Energy Outlook, which was our first in-depth, comprehensive assessment of this region. The report built on decades of cooperation with governments, industry, multilateral organizations, and other key stakeholders across Latin America. And I've seen a few people here already today who were very helpful. Thank you. The aim was to support the energy goals of countries in the region, exploring the opportunities, challenges, and providing insights on interaction between the region's energy future and global energy trends. Latin America and the Caribbean represent 8% of the global population and 7% of the global economy, but the region can play an outsized role in the global transition. Latin America stands out for its significant endowment of energy resources, fossil fuels, renewable energy, critical minerals, and for policies that have delivered clean electricity. The expansion of renewable energy technologies, such as hydropower and bioenergy, initially driven by energy security concerns, are now more to meet sustainability commitments. In addition, solar and wind energy have grown substantially in recent years. Nearly half of the countries in the region have pledged to reach net zero emissions by 2050 or earlier. So while this presentation often shows the region as a whole, it is important to keep in mind that each country has its unique history, geography, resources, challenges, opportunities, and energy mix. We see this in the slide. This also means that a different mix of policies will be needed, depending on the country, depending upon the unique circumstances. There's not one size fits all. Now let's look at how the region compares to the global average. Fossil fuels account for 2/3 of Latin America and the Caribbean's energy mix. This is well below the 80% global average. Coal use is relatively low, just 5% of the mix, compared to over 1/4 globally. But it is an important exported commodity. Coal demand has been stagnant for the past decade, being used mostly in industry and power generation, and only in a few countries. On the other hand, oil represents a larger share in the region, at 40%, than the worldwide average. Oil still plays an important role as the primary fuel in transport, and so this is one area to focus attention. A key asset for the region is its low emissions electricity supply. The use of renewable energy has been a mainstay, with hydropower being the longtime foundation of electricity. At 60% of renewables, this is double the global average and decades ahead. Bioenergy and biofuels also play a big role in the region, with the share of biofuels in road transport twice the global average. The region is the world's second largest producer of biofuels, and in short, is a global leader in this area. Now, looking at energy efficiency, the region is lagging a little bit. Over the last 2 decades, annual intensity improvements have been about 1/4 the global average. There is significant room to increase policy coverage on energy efficiency. For example, less than 1/3 of countries have minimum energy performance standards in place for industrial motors or household appliances, and few have mandatory building codes for energy. Our analysis shows that adopting the best available technologies for products such as air conditioners could moderate energy demand at little or no cost to consumers. So at the IEA, we see great potential for further cooperation here. This gives an idea of where the region stands today, but let's look ahead. In the energy mix, oil's share of total energy demand is higher than the global average. In the stated policy scenario, which reflects today's policy settings in each country, we see oil use remaining broadly stable as the dominant fuel in transport. This is the blue bar in the slide. This is also the case for natural gas and coal, which remain broadly stable in 2030 and to 2050, with the share of fossil fuels declining just to 50%. This is not in line with the goals and targets set by governments, so will require further policy action. If, however, in a separate scenario, our announced pledges scenario, all pledges and targets are achieved on time, and this includes targets such as the COP, NDCs, and the Sustainable Development Goals, we see a different pathway, leading to a decline in fossil fuel use. On this path, consumption of each fossil fuel peaks this decade and then steadily declines. The use of oil is cut by 10% by 2030, with most reductions taking place in the transport sector. This is notably due to increased availability of public transport, efficiency gains, cleaner fuels, and electric vehicles, with almost 16 million electric vehicles, including buses, on the roads by 2030. In this scenario, 1 out of 5 cars and buses sold in 2030 is electric, compared to only 1 out of 20 today. At the same time, oil production continues to grow to 2030 in the region, led by major increases in Guyana and Brazil. In fact, over the period to 2030, these are 2 of the 3 largest increases in production in the world. However, globally, new oil projects would face major commercial risks if the world is on track to deliver net zero emissions by 2050, as oil demand declines rapidly. Turning now to CO2 emissions. Latin America and the Caribbean have long had relatively low levels for the size of the economy. The region has accounted for just 5% of all global energy-related greenhouse gas emissions since 1971, while representing 9% of global GDP. With today's policy settings, shown as the blue line on the left, our analysis finds that energy-related CO2 emissions remain broadly at their current level to 2030 and even increase to 2050, mainly driven by higher industry output and more transport demand. However, again, moving to the stricter announced pledges scenario, which is in yellow, it would be a different path. Fulfilling announced targets would see energy-related CO2 emissions decline to 2030 and fall by more than 50% by 2050. As with all regions, reaching global net zero emissions by 2050 calls for steeper reductions. To bridge the gap between rising emissions and fulfilling pledges and ambitions, additional policies and measures will be needed. But which policies would we see as the most important? In our analysis, we identified key mitigation measures at little or no cost to consumers. 1, additional policy support to accelerate the uptake of renewables, including wind and solar photovoltaic, for example, through expanded auction schemes, biofuels in transport, and bioenergy in industry. 2, electrification of transport, industry, and buildings to take advantage of clean electricity supplies. 3, improved energy efficiency to cut the growth of overall and peak energy demand and make energy more affordable. Further measures on the end-use sector side include avoided demand through behavioral measures. In addition, reducing emissions in oil and gas production, plus carbon capture, utilization and storage, and hydrogen play a minor role in the short term for the rest of the decade, but become increasingly important after 2030. And looking beyond CO2, reduced flaring and methane emissions reductions can also make a significant contribution. And looking beyond the energy sector, there's great potential for improvements in land use and agriculture. There's another important aspect that needs to be considered, and that is the impact of the transition on people. An increasing amount of IEA analysis is focused on the broader social aspects and impacts of the clean energy transition, from inclusiveness to employment to affordability. We believe that Latin America and the Caribbean has all the ingredients to achieve a people-centered and inclusive transition. The transition can help to achieve environmental, social, and economic goals, ranging from reducing air pollution to increasing energy access to creating jobs. The numbers in this slide come from our announced pledges scenario, which is more ambitious than the policies currently in place and require additional action. The IEA estimates that the energy transition offers an opportunity to create more than 1 million new clean energy jobs to add to the 3 million already in this area, and that's in Latin America and the Caribbean. Transitions can also contribute to bring workers into the formal economy, including training and certification, but also access to social protection systems such as pensions and healthcare. It is important to emphasize the role of sustainable financing in helping Latin America to pursue a just energy transition. Efforts at de-risking investments, reducing the cost of capital, and applying innovative financial instruments can increase the flow of resources committed to low-carbon infrastructure. The region is currently leading in terms of raising the profile of people-centered transitions worldwide. Examples include application of the concept of energy communities, focus on poverty alleviation and clean cooking, as well as ensuring that energy projects bring local value for communities that are affected by them. And beyond achieving its own transition, Latin America and the Caribbean can also secure a key position in the global energy transition. The region can utilize its vast resources to play an important role in the supply of low-emissions fuels and resources to other markets. For example, biofuels. Adding to current exports, development of advanced biofuels can open new markets and help cut emissions. Hydrogen. The region is already on track to produce low-cost, low-emissions hydrogen for domestic use and export. Significant critical mineral resources also offer great opportunities to broaden the current mineral production portfolio, add value to the production outputs, and deliver economic benefits. Revenue from the production of critical minerals in the region is already significant, and by 2030, in the announced pledges scenario, increases by 50% and even passes revenues from fossil fuel production in the longer term. And so to sum up, all regions of the world face challenges in face of clean energy transitions, but there are also enormous opportunities. Latin America and the Caribbean, already a leader in this area, is well positioned not only to overcome the obstacles, but also to reap the benefits. At the IEA, we look forward to continuing to work with the countries across the region to achieve this. Thank you very much.
Agradecemos la reciente participación e invitamos a la doctora Rebeca a que permanezca en el escenario para que nos acompañe en el siguiente panel.